everybody, and welcome to episode 6 of the Bench Podcast. Once again, I'm Aaron Valentino. I'm doing alongside Jacob Johnson and Brandon Ladden. Today, we have another special guest for you. Last week, we had Seth Rosenthal, and this week, we have Mets beat reporter for The Athletic, Tim Britton. Tim, thanks for joining the show. How are you?
Hanging in there, guys. How about you guys?
Feeling good. Missing sports. Jake, Lad?
Yeah, doing good.
So, Tim, we're just going to ask you a couple questions here. No big deal. But first off, there are no sports right now. As you know, it's almost been 2 months without a live sporting event. Obviously, ESPN has just picked up recently the KBO Baseball League. But Tim, what have you been doing during this time of quarantine?
Well, it's funny because I've said this to a lot of people I know in my family that I feel like this impacts me less than almost anyone I know because I'm used to working from home and doing the types of stories I'm doing now in the off season. The months of November through January are a lot of the same style of you're calling people on the phone, you're doing some maybe Mets history stories, you're doing some speculative stories about who they might sign and all that. So this isn't that dissimilar, just the basic work day for me of getting up, okay, who can I email, who can I text, who can I call today on a story I'm going to work on for the next week. You're thinking longer term with stories now than you might during the regular season when it's night to night. But it's still pretty similar to what I do for a couple months of the year. So it's not a totally new feeling for me.
That the KBO kind of started last night, and I watched the first 4 innings of the game, and Jeff Passan came on and said that they've been kind of talking about a timetable for a return to the MLB, and that it would be, June 10th would be a start of a spring training too, and then a July 1st start to a season. Have you been hearing the same things, or, what have you been hearing about a timetable for the MLB to return?
Well, I mean, I would defer to the big-time reporters like Jeff, like Ken Rosenthal at The Athletic. They're the ones more in communication with the Players Association, with the owners, with the commissioner about a possible timeline. I know Ken wrote in The Athletic the other day that, July 4th would seem like a reasonable starting point, a symbolic starting point, certainly, for the national pastime. And I've heard those things. I do still think there are a lot of logistical hurdles to overcome in terms of getting increased testing out there so that you don't feel bad about testing professional athletes on a regular basis if regular citizens don't have the access to them. So I think that's the first big hurdle that needs to be cleared before we kind of move forward with this. But there's certainly in the last 2 weeks, there's been greater optimism within the sport that we're going to have some semblance of a 2020 season. It's not going to look like a normal one. There probably won't be fans for the majority, if not all of it. I don't know what ballparks we'll be playing in, but I do think that at some point in this calendar year, we'll have actual Major League Baseball.
Just like you said, saying 2020 isn't going to look like other baseball seasons. One of the worries a few weeks ago when the reports were coming out about what the 2020 season might look like was players being separated from their families for months, or players being isolated in different areas. Have you been in contact with any players the past few weeks about what their feelings or emotions would be about a season that is just going to be so much different?
Basically what I've heard is that I think the majority of players would be willing to play kind of regardless of the circumstances, but the minority of players who don't want to play, that's still a sizable chunk. It's not like it's 95% want to play and 5% have concerns. It's more like a 55-45, a 60-40, that kind of thing. So you have players, and you understand those concerns. Like, you don't want to be away from your family for months on end, especially if you are just married, if you're preparing for a wedding, if you're going to have a child, those kinds of things. That's a pretty big ask to make of anyone, regardless of how much money you're scheduled to make. So I think there are, like I said, with logistical hurdles, certainly the initial plan we heard about, like the Arizona bubble plan, I don't think you're going to see a wide swath of support for that among players, especially if other things seem feasible. The way the Arizona plan can happen is essentially if they say, this is the only way we're going to have baseball this year, and then maybe in a more condensed time frame. Like that idea for a bubble sport kind of makes more sense to me for the NBA, where, okay, you've got 12 players, maybe you have the 16 playoff teams do it, rather than 30 teams of 30 guys for Major League Baseball.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's going to be, really fun to see how this whole thing, turns out. If there's, if they play 108 games, I think, pretty much every game is going to matter, which is going to be so great, I think, for baseball in the long run. But it'll be a lot of fun. We obviously can't wait for baseball to get back. But Tim, you are the Mets beat reporter for the Athletics. You have been for a couple of years. So you watch a lot of the NL East. You've seen a lot of these NL East teams play, and it's one of those divisions where it seems like there's going to be 4 teams. We said this last year too, and the Braves kind of ran away with it a little bit. But, last year and going into this year, there could really be 4 teams that could compete for the top spot in that division. So going into this season, what do you kind of think the NL East is going to be once baseball, does come back?
Yeah, I still think that the Braves are kind of a cut above at this point. You look at they've kind of been I see the fist pump there. And as a kid growing up in the 90s as a Mets fan, man, hated the Braves so much. You look at the young talent they have, it's only going to get better. Like Ronald Acuna almost had the 40-40 season last year. He's still, he's a future MVP candidate. You've got Freddie Freeman already at first base. Ozzie Albies, obviously, as good a second baseman as there is maybe in the National League. So you've got so much young talent. You've got more coming on the pitching side of it. And then they've kind of fortified, they've rounded out their rotation. This break will help Cole Hamels be healthy. You would think for the start of the season, their bullpen looks much deeper than it's been in the last couple of years. So I think they've just progressed more than I expected them to, even in the last year. I thought they were, okay, they won the division with 90 wins in 2018. I thought maybe a 92-win team last year, but they won, 97 or 98? They lose Donaldson, which hurts the middle of that order, but I think they've got maybe a more balanced order going into this year. And then I think that the Nats, the lineup doesn't look as strong. So a lot of it depends on the health of the top of their pitching staff. If Max Scherzer has any lingering effects from what he was dealing with in spring training, that really changes your outlook on them. But I still think they're probably just a little bit ahead of the Mets and Phillies, teams that you can see things going well for them, but they rely on maybe a few more ifs than Atlanta and Washington at this point.
Yeah, and it's definitely going to be really interesting to see when we start back up. Whenever we do start back up, we'll get back to the NL East a little later. We're going to kind of dive into how you got your start and how you got your job at the Athletics. So where did you end up going to college, and what was your major? And kind of to add on to that, have you always known that you wanted to be a beat reporter or a beat writer? If that's what you went to college for, did you change your plan somewhere in there?
Yeah, well, so I didn't always want to be a sports writer because I wanted to be a professional athlete. I generally thought of, taking the Bo Jackson route, but a little bit harder, maybe being a 3-sport star as a kid. But that wasn't going to happen by the time I was about 8 or 9 years old. So I had my own newspaper at that point that I've written about a few times, the Tim Times, about basically the games that I played against my older brothers. So I guess that was pointing toward my eventual career. I wrote for my high school paper, and then I went to college at Duke. Not really with the sense, not with the inevitability that I would get into journalism, but with that as kind of the main thing that I would try first. And Duke doesn't have or didn't have then a set journalism school the way Syracuse or Northwestern or Missouri do. But I wrote for the school paper there, the Duke Chronicle. I got to cover the soccer team pretty in depth when they were number 1 in the country. The basketball team for 2 or 3 years during a down phase in Duke basketball. It was not their greatest years. And so I did that, and that kind of, I was an English major, a history minor, and I got a certificate in journalism, which was essentially the equivalent of a minor because we didn't have the full program at that point. And then got an internship with minorleaguebaseball.com before my senior year, and then an internship with MLB.com after I had graduated, covering the Mets in the 2009 season, like their home games as an intern with Marty Noble and Anthony DiComo. And I was able to turn that, it took me a little while to get a full-time job. I ended up doing the internship again in 2010, covering the Yankees home games with Brian Hoke. But eventually, for the 2011 season, I got a job with the Providence Journal in Rhode Island, covering the Red Sox, and spent 7 years on the beat there with Brian McPherson, learning a lot from different beat writers on how to cover a big beat like the Red Sox. I mean, like the Mets and Yankees are also. I've always worked with 9 or 10 other beat writers. And then after the 2017 season, when the Athletic was expanding more to cover every major league team, I chatted with them about the Mets opening and was fortunate enough to get it.
So you've actually known, sorry to cut you off, Brandon, but you've known Anthony DiComo, for a while then. That's kind of funny.
Yeah, so it's funny that almost all of the Mets beat has changed since that 2009 season. The Mets as an organization have essentially changed since that 09 season. But DiComo is still there, and Mike Puma from the New York Post is the only full-time beat writer still there from that time.
So you talked about joining the Athletic in 2017 when they were expanding. They're a pretty fascinating company that they've been able to go into all these local regions and grab writers and be able to build an online brand like they have. At what point did you notice the Athletic and realize that this was a company where you could have a lot of success for your career?
It was probably either late 2016 or early 2017. I knew they had the site in Chicago first, so I knew like Sahadev Sharma was writing about the Cubs for them, and then they were opening spots in Cleveland and some other cities, doing a lot of NHL coverage at that point. So I knew in the back of my mind that they had started to talk to a couple baseball writers in different markets. Being in Boston at the time, the sense was that they weren't going to be in Boston anytime soon. They weren't going to go after a market that was already flush with as many outlets as Boston had. So I didn't really have them on my radar as a place I might work at. I know when Ken Rosenthal joined them, I think that was the summer of 2017. That's when I subscribed, because you can't be a major league beat writer and not read what Ken is writing. And that's when I realized, I was like, I thought I was going to be paying, the $3.99 a month for just Ken or just one team. That's when I realized, like, you can get everything. Oh, that's pretty cool. Like I can read anything about the Cubs and the Indians or whatever teams they were covering at that point for just the one price. So that's my plug for the Athletic. You can read everything for just the one price. And then that winter meetings, I heard they were more aggressively expanding into different markets and trying to cover as many major league teams as possible. So that's when I first got the thought that maybe that might be a nice place to work for. Because I know at the Projo at that time, we were kind of cutting back our coverage. We weren't going to be able to travel to every road game the way we had in previous years. So I was starting to think that it might be time to move on. And I was fortunate enough to eventually talk to the Athletic that off season and move to New York.
Wow, that's a really great story there. But so obviously, you're a beat reporter. So a lot of people, read your game stories, your pregame stories, your postgame stories. And, obviously throughout the week, you're coming up with different types of stories. And now even more so without, baseball to write those game stories, you're coming up with more weekly stories. So what's the kind of process that you go through when you're coming up for a weekly story?
Well, I'll go back first to when I worked at the Providence Journal. Our basic daily schedule was like we had to write, you had the game story, which was due essentially last pitch. Once final pitch of the game, your story's up on the website. And then you had a notebook that was, 500 to 700 words and a pregame story that would run that, was about 750 words. It would run on the cover in case the game ran too long, which with the Red Sox was a nightly concern, or would go inside the paper if the game story made it. And so, I had to write essentially a feature every day of the season. And so that really trains your mind to being like, okay, what is going on with this season? There are the minor like post-game sidebar-y kind of things you can do. Okay, the backup catcher went 2 for 4 in this game. I can write 400 words about that was a nice 2 for 4, or I could talk to him the next day, talk to the hitting coach and say, what is he doing differently that allows him to go 2 for 4 once? And a lot of those, sometimes those stories don't pan out. I had to learn very early that I'm going to write stories that I dislike immediately. That happens from time to time when you're writing as many as we do. And now with the Athletic, what's nice is, if I have a story that I don't really like as much, I don't have to run it. There's not that blank space in the paper waiting for it because it is an online site. So that helps a bit. There'll be ideas that I work on and I'll tell my editor, I'm planning on this for this day. And that either I don't have everything I want, or it's just not come together the way I want, and I don't have to write it. Whereas, for a newspaper, you've got to run those things. But with that in mind, I'm also thinking I don't want to run something that someone can read for free somewhere else. I don't want to write the basic story that that the New York Post is going to write, or Newsday is going to write, or the Daily News, because if it's in those papers, if you get those papers, you're not going to go somewhere else to get it. So to me, it's trying to do something a little bit deeper, to use kind of the format we have. Like, I can put charts and GIFs and videos in my stories in a way that you can't for a newspaper, to take advantage of that, to just try to go kind of that one level deeper than maybe you could when you're working with a time crunch on a deadline, the way you have to for a newspaper.
So, as you got your start there with The Athletic, and you've continued to do great work there, it's been very interesting to, hear what you say about how you transitioned. So going towards the scandal that we all see as baseball fans this past season with the Houston Astros, what stain do you think that left on baseball? And did you follow that as closely, and did you write about that at all? Or what was your feeling on the scandal with the Houston Astros?
Yeah, I mean, I had heard that story was coming out, maybe a couple days before it actually did. Having working for the Athletic with Ken and Evan, Kevin Evan Drellick, who broke that story. So I knew that Carlos Beltran was involved in that, and I chatted with them. We were kind of trying to decide how much to play it from a Mets perspective, because obviously the Mets themselves were not part of the scandal. Beltran didn't work for them at the time. They were kind of this secondary element to it, but he did work for them then, and this was presumably something they probably should have investigated themselves, at least if not when they were hiring him, then at least once the story came out. And one thing I do look back and regret is not writing enough in November at the time that this has a chance of costing Beltran his job. Kind of not just what MLB might suspend or punish him for formally, but just how it changes his perception in the clubhouse. I don't think I foresaw how strong the reaction would be from players to this going on, especially pitchers, and how difficult it would be for Beltran to stand in a clubhouse, in the Mets clubhouse, and win the trust of his pitching staff and his players. The way that, that was one of the big selling points of him, was this is a guy who walks into your clubhouse and has instant credibility, and because of the scandal, that was gone. And I didn't kind of grasp that, I think, until mid-January, about the time they were moving on from him. So I look at that as a mistake on my part, in not kind of realizing the magnitude of something at the time. In terms of the scandal and how it affects how we kind of look at baseball, I do think, there is that thought that every team does this. Why are we piling on the Astros? Clearly, I think Houston did it to an extent that no one else in baseball does it right now. There are fun past examples, like the 1951 Giants were stealing signs, and everyone knows that now. And other teams in that era, and they're kind of looked on as those quirky teams back then. But I think it reminds me a little bit of, and you guys are probably too young for the NBA in the 2000s, around the the Lakers Kings series in 2002, when there was just the thought that the NBA refs were going to help the big market teams. And I didn't necessarily believe wholeheartedly in that conspiracy, but I remember there would be games I'm watching where, okay, it's game 6 of a series, and I'm saying, the team down in the series is going to win because they want game 7. And I think that's that kind of cynicism or skepticism about the validity of the sport, the integrity of the sport, is really damaging to it long term. So I think it's important for Major League Baseball to kind of they don't want your fans thinking that about games, that it's not on the level, that some team is cheating in some form or fashion. So I do think it's important that they punish the Astros as strongly as they did, if not the players themselves, the organization, and that they probably haven't sent as strong a message as they can, but they sent a reasonably strong message for now, and we'll see kind of what measures are put into place between now and maybe the next negotiations for the next CBA after the 2021 season, to ensure something like this doesn't happen again.
Yeah. So with that situation, you had the punishments we have now, but there's still a chance that Carlos Beltran and Alex Cora in a few years might be able to get a coaching job again. Would you be okay with that? How do they earn back the trust of players in their locker room if that occurs?
Yeah, I'm actually really interested in seeing how that timeline works because I think, I can see AJ Hinch and Jeff Lunau coming back a little bit sooner than Cora and Beltran. That's because they weren't implicated quite to the same extent that Cora and Beltran were in Major League Baseball's report. And Hinch, for instance, has such a strong track record as a manager that's going to be really appealing to a team that needs a jump start. I think Cora would probably get a shot before Beltran because, again, he won a World Series as a manager. Beltran, you don't know he's going to be a great manager. You can think he's going to be a great manager, but do you want to risk that PR hit and that there is a risk that the players don't buy into him the way they might otherwise because of this stain for him. So I think it might take a little bit longer for Beltran, certainly for Cora, than it would for Hinch to return as a manager in Major League Baseball.
So another major, maybe not scandal, but another major thing that was going around Major League Baseball this year was the home run rate just absolutely skyrocketed this year. And you really got to see that firsthand. I think 5 Mets players this season hit over 20 home runs, which had only happened, I think, once in their history before that. And obviously Pete Alonso with 53 home runs his rookie year, breaking the rookie record. So Tim, we got to ask you, do you think Major League Baseball did something to those balls that made them fly out of the park the way they did?
Yeah, I think the evidence, both circumstantial originally and then more like materialistic physical evidence, suggests that the ball is not quite the same. I don't know that it's Major League Baseball doing it on purpose. It is reasonable to say that kind of more consistent manufacturing of the baseball than in old times would lead it to be this product rather than what it used to be. The seams are a little tighter, so it's it's more aerodynamic. Hitting the ball with the same force propels it further than it would otherwise. But I do think it would be nice to normalize again. And I think most fans kind of feel that way. You don't want the traditional numbers in your mind, like 30 and 100, and what that means to hit 30 home runs and have 100 RBIs. It doesn't feel the same when every team's got 1 or 2 guys doing it. That was the case during the steroid era in 99 and 2000, 2001. You had these just outlandish numbers that kind of reset what you thought was a good season. And now you're looking, I forget how many home runs. It was like Freddie Galvis and Rougned Odor hitting, and you're like, oh, those guys hit 28 home runs. That's a guy who does that. So that kind of just throws off your perception of the sport. So I would like to see it as a guy who really likes good pitching too, and who kind of commiserates with pitchers on the Mets when they give up pretty good pitches that are poked out for home runs. I would like to see that the ball normalized. And I think there is some evidence that in the postseason it was, again, different than it had been in the regular season. And that seems like it could be maybe more of a concerted effort from the higher ups than might have been in the regular season. So I don't know exactly how to control that and all of the physical factors that go into it. But it would be nice if we were back to kind of a more normal run scoring environment.
Well, one of the things that I saw last night when I was watching the KBO is that Carl Ravitch has said that the KBO had stopped juicing their baseballs this season. The last 2 or 3 years, home runs were flying out of the park, and that's why we see these insane bat flips coming from the KBO. So last night when they said we're not going to be seeing as many home runs, so the bat flips are going to be more, that's because they kind of stopped doing what they had been with the baseball. So it'll be interesting to see if baseball or the MLB takes after the KBO in that way. So kind of moving back towards the NL East, what team right now do you think is being helped most by this delay in the NL East?
That's interesting because I think you would say, just like theoretically, if you took 5 teams, you would say the team that gets helped the most is the team. Like a shorter season means you can have weirder results. If in a 3-game series is not going to be as representative as a 7-game series, which isn't as representative as like a 50-game series. So a worse team can do better over, if we're talking about a 100-game season than 162. So that would theoretically, that helps the Marlins, it helps the Phillies, it helps the Mets, who might not be as good as the Braves and Nationals. When I look at it from the Mets perspective, though, they're a team like they don't have the pitching depth that I think you're really going to need if we're playing these 100 games in a condensed form, which I'm assuming we're going to do. Like the Braves have a deeper starting rotation, a deeper glut of pitchers that they can call up from AAA or a reserve list, however we're going to do the minor leagues, both in their rotation and in their bullpen than the Mets do. So I think that helps Atlanta. You can see some weird small sample things happen if the season is shorter. But I do think teams that have really good depth and maybe rely a little bit less on star power at the top of the lineup, top of the pitching staff, might be the ones that win out here. And I think that probably points most to Atlanta.
So going back to your Mets roots here, you said you were a fan growing up, and then sounds like your career timeline, you kind of get taken away from them. But what was your experience with the 2015 World Series? Were you just a fan at the time? Were you able to make it to any of those games?
Yeah, so in 2015, I was covering the Red Sox that regular season. They finished in last place that season, actually. So they were not in the playoffs. And so I was able to, so much of the experience of being a baseball fan is hanging out with your team on a nightly basis and just having the game on, whether you're actively watching it or just it's passively on in the background. And once I started covering other teams in 2010, it became a lot more difficult to do that during the regular season. I might see, in 2015, I probably saw like 5 to 7 Mets games live, all regular season. So my connection with that team wasn't the way it was like for the 99 Mets or the 2000 Mets, the 2006 Mets in the playoffs. But once the playoffs started, it was nice that I didn't have as much work to do because the Red Sox weren't in the playoffs. They weren't looking to hire a general manager or manager that month. So I was able to watch most of the Mets games in the playoffs. It was nice because my older brothers are both Mets fans. So, when I was covering the Red Sox, I would talk about the games I'm watching all the time, and they're not the same ones they're watching at any point. They don't care about the Red Sox at all. So it was nice to be able to talk about a baseball game that we're watching together and to show off how much more I now knew about baseball because I had covered it. It was really nice to rub that in a little bit too. So it was cool to be able to see, to watch those games against the Dodgers in the NLDS. That Game 5 is such a remarkable baseball game. And I feel like I appreciated that game more because I knew more about the sport than I did when I was just a fan, and you can kind of see what goes into it. And then I was able to go, it was nice. The Baseball Writers Association offers tickets to the World Series. You have to pay for them. They're not cheap, but I was able to get tickets for the 3 home games at Citi Field, games 3, 4, and 5 of that World Series. And I went to each of them with one of my brothers. So we were able to watch it. I was not as invested in it as I would have been as a fan as they were. When Lucas Duda's throw home goes wide, my brother collapsed into his seat. I felt like I'd reached that point where if they win, it'll be really cool. If they lose, I won't feel as bad as I would otherwise. So it was kind of like getting the best of fandom without that terrible other side, where winning is actually feels better than losing feels bad. And that was a strange place to realize that I was at as a fan.
You talked to David Wright recently in your last interview for the Metro Perspective, and he said every time he hears the name Yadier Molina, he gets, shivers down his spine. Every time I hear the name Lucas Duda, I feel the same way. So There you go. So obviously, you watch a lot of Mets games. Like you said, you go to pretty much every game as a Mets beat reporter for The Athletic. But, do you follow other teams, maybe other teams in the NL East, and what storylines around baseball really sort of draw your attention throughout the season?
Yeah, well, I do think one of the hardest things about being a baseball writer or a baseball fan is that you can't really get a global perspective of the league if you're concentrating exclusively on one, if you're concentrating so intently on one team as most fans do, as we writers do. I always we get to the playoffs and everyone gets mad at the national broadcast. They hate the national broadcasters. And it's because they haven't seen your team the way you have. It's not like it's an NBC Sunday Night Football and Chris Collinsworth is calling a Week 15 game between the Eagles and Bears. And he's seen all 14 previous games both teams have played. He's watched every time they've met in the last 4 years. He's seen every game all of these guys have ever played in their lives. You can't do that with a baseball season. So I think one of the things we lose is kind of that global perspective sometimes, where you think, oh, like this guy on my team is the best or he is the worst, because you don't see what it's like to root for a different team. I feel like that happens to closers all the time. Like everyone hates their closer and thinks that every other closer is amazing because they don't see that closer on a regular basis. So I think it's hard. I try my hardest to read up on what's going on with other teams, especially in the NL East. It's nice at The Athletic that we've got writers with each team, so I can kind of, if the Mets are about to play the Braves in a series, I can go back and read what David O'Brien's been writing the last week or 10 days to get a sense for what's going on with that team. And I can do that with any team. When they played the Tigers last year, man, I could name like 4 players on the Tigers. I knew the Tigers really well when I was covering the Red Sox because they played them in the playoffs. They saw them more often. But now I'm like, man, who is Spencer Turnbull? Like this guy is starting this weekend. So I can go back and get some sense of who those players were. But it is hard, I think, in this sport to know what's going on all the time. That's why, things like Fangraphs and Baseball Prospectus, they really help because they have more of that national perspective that you can get a quick sense of, okay, this starter that I don't really know has had a great 2-month stretch here that's maybe underreported nationally. And I get to, I can read a story on Fangraphs about what he's doing differently, and then I can go to The Athletic and read, whatever writer covers him. Maybe there's more of a feature story on him and get a better sense of who he is and what he's doing.
So I completely agree with what you were saying before, Tim, is that when I was watching the Cardinals-Braves series, the announcers were really, I don't know why, but saying really good things about Tyler Flowers. And I had watched him all season, and I'm convinced that Tyler Flowers is the worst catcher in the MLB. And they were saying that he's so good. And I was just like, I don't get it, Joe Buck. Or whoever was doing the announcing, I was just not excited by their opinions.
Every day you complained about Tyler Flowers. Every day.
And then they re-signed him. And then they re-signed him for you.
He's back on our team. But moving from that, obviously you're a baseball fan. Who are your top 5 players right now in the MLB other than Mets players?
Other than Mets players.
To watch or to, just see what they do.
That's a tough one. Just in the NL East, I think it's really fun to watch Freddie Freeman, especially like Freddie Freeman against Jacob deGrom is so much fun. However many, we get that 10 to 15 times a year because you see the mutual respect they have for one another and the different ways. I feel like they bring out the best in one another. So I really like Freeman for that purpose. Acuna is really fun to watch just because of all of the different things he's able to do as a player. It was awesome in Boston to see Mookie Betts grow from like this guy that you heard about a little bit when he was first drafted to become the superstar that he is. It's probably trite to say Mike Trout, but I don't see enough of him. So it is really fun when I do sit back, turn on an Angels game and see him playing. I haven't named any pitchers, and that's weird because I like pitchers probably more than hitters. So, like DeGrom is a really fun pitcher to watch. I actually really enjoyed watching Zach Wheeler with the Mets also because I felt like Wheeler, there was a little bit more range of outcomes to what he was going to do than DeGrom. He kind of understood DeGrom was going to give you 7 innings and 2 runs, and Wheeler, there might be a little bit more tinkering that had to take place in the middle of a game for him to get back on track. In like Chris Sale is fun to watch as a pitcher. I'm not really naming anyone like unique. Like the best players are the most fun to watch. And since I don't get to see so many of them on a consistent basis, it is nice when I do get to see them.
You said something interesting there. The best players are the most fun to watch. And that's your opinion as a very educated baseball fan. But are you ever worried? I've seen studies that more people know Yasiel Puig than about Mike Trout. Do you think baseball has an image problem where their star players just don't get the attention that a LeBron James or a Russell Wilson would, like we see with other sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, you're not going to have a baseball player who's on the same level of popularity or fame as probably the most famous basketball player will be at any given point. Like the closest baseball's come in 30 years to a Michael Jordan is Ken Griffey Jr. And we haven't had anyone really that close to him since. But you would hope that like the best like a guy like Mike Trout, who is as good a baseball player as there has been in a long time, would be more famous than like J.R. Smith. You hope that you can reach that level with him. And I think because baseball, it's still a regional sport. It's still a sport where you follow your team and you can't follow every team like we talked about earlier. That there are going to be really good players that even people who like and care about baseball don't know well enough, don't see on a regular basis. I can, as a football fan, as a basketball fan, I can watch a lot of Damian Lillard in Portland in a way that like I can't see. I couldn't watch a lot of Ichiro in Seattle growing up, that kind of thing. But I do think baseball can do a much better job of promoting the personalities within the game, of embracing the personality within the game rather than shunning it as like against the unwritten rules kind of thing. Like when Alex Bregman and Juan Soto are carrying their bats all the way to first base in the World Series, like we shouldn't get a column from George Will the next day in the Washington Post saying this is what is wrong with baseball. We should have maybe someone else talk about how cool it is to see that kind of call and raise in the middle of a World Series game the way Bregman and Soto had. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the response across the U.S. is to if the KBO is embraced in any way, and if we see people who love the bat flips there, because it is really cool to see that. A lot of players when they go down to winter leagues in the Dominican or Puerto Rico, and they see kind of how baseball is played there and how fun and celebratory it is. Guys who wouldn't dare flip a bat in the U.S. will go down there and might do it a little bit because that's just part of it, and it's fun. So I do think there is, we saw last year MLB's whole marketing campaign before the postseason was about embracing youth and all that. And I would like to see that keep going and maybe keep going in a more tangible fashion than we saw last October.
That's actually a really good point. You can watch a lot of football games, even if you don't get like Sunday ticket or anything like that. There are teams that are all the way in California that you can see on a weekly basis. And baseball, it's really more of a regional sport where, the Mets are going to be on the East Coast and the Mariners are going to be on the West Coast. It's just how it is. It's actually a really interesting point. So getting back to, the eastern side of things here in New York, obviously, you're the Mets beat reporter, and there's a team in the Bronx that's really good and has been better for the majority of the Mets' tenure. 27 world championships, and the Mets only have 2. But, this past decade, Mets won a pennant and the Yankees didn't. So do you still kind of feel like the Mets are in the Yankees' shadow, being kind of the little brother of New York, even though the Mets kind of had a better decade, but not really? The Yankees made more playoff appearances.
Yeah, I think the way the Mets are operated kind of keeps them in the shadow. Like they're always kind of fighting for attention. I am the youngest of 3 brothers, so I get the feeling. You know what it's like when you just want a little bit of the spotlight on you for a change. And I think that leads to some negative impulses from the Mets where they might like a back page regardless of the quality of the back page, whether it's good news or bad news. They just want to make news. I think there are certainly instances in Mets history where they have been the team in New York. You go back to the late 60s and early 70s when they were more consistently competitive than the Yankees were at that time. Really for most of the 80s, really from like 1984 on through 1990. The Yankees were not in the playoffs at any point in that stretch. And the Mets, if we had the current playoff system, would have been in it, I think, every year of that stretch. But they only got the 1 championship out of it. And I think that's probably why I was a Mets fan, was that my older brothers were growing up more during that period of time. So it was more fun to root for Darryl Strawberry and Doc Gooden than it was Don Mattingly or anyone on the Yankees at that time. So I think there are certainly times in Mets history where they have been the team in New York, and they just haven't had it for a long stretch in a generation or so. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. There will come a stretch probably where the Yankees finish under 500 for the first time since 93, 92. So there will be a time when the Yankees aren't as good as they are. I don't see it coming in the next couple of years. where the Mets can kind of come back, but it'll be a little while probably.
Yeah, I think it's definitely hard, especially, we see the Yankees make all these big moves, the biggest one signing Garrett Cole. They always make these big free agent splashes, the Giancarlo Stanton. Now they have the big Aaron Judge. So you kind of just don't see the Mets doing that as much. They kind of build their team with smaller free agent moves. And so I think that's kind of why the Yankees are looked at as bigger, because they're making the bigger moves.
Yeah. I mean, certainly the Yankees have spent more than the Mets have throughout history. And, you go back to like 1999 through 2012 or so. I think the Yankees had the highest payroll in baseball every year during that stretch. And for the first part of that, like it wasn't that they had the highest, they were like, 50% higher than any other team in baseball. And then the Mets, for many of those years, ran second or third in payroll. But things have changed for the Mets financially. Since the Bernie Madoff stuff in 2009, 2010, the Mets payroll dipped for the first half of the decade. It came back in the second half. I'm interested in seeing, first of all, what happens if there is an ownership change in the next couple of years, as the Wilpons are trying to sell the team. And then, if they get into a free agency period where they've got a fair amount of money coming off the books this year. They've got Yoenis Cespedes coming off. They've got David Wright officially coming off the books. If there is someone out there that they make the big splash on in a way they haven't really, they haven't signed a $100 million free agent from outside the organization since Carlos Beltran in 2005. So it's been 15 years. And I'm interested in seeing when that next step is going to happen.
So moving on from baseball, our last question here, and then we'll let you go, is obviously the Jordan documentary is going on right now. It's the biggest thing filling our sports void. Have you been, paying attention to it, and what are your thoughts so far on how they've done in the first episodes that they've released?
So I feel terrible because I haven't seen it yet, because I'm kind of saving it. I know. It's funny. My fiance and I just got through, Ken Burns did this documentary on the Vietnam War that we started watching in like 2015 or whenever it came out. And we finally got through it this past weekend. It took us 4 or 5 years to get through an 18-hour documentary. And I was like, do you want to start watching the Bulls documentary? And she's like, how long is that? I was like, 10 hours. It's like, no, we can't just dive right into that again. So I'm putting that on hold for a little bit. Certainly that was my youth growing up as an NBA fan in particular at that point. Jordan was so annoying. How often he came through, because I liked the Knicks with Patrick Ewing. I grew up a Nets fan. I didn't actually get to see the Nets play much until they made the playoffs in '98, and the Bulls knocked them out in a couple close games in the first round. I liked John Stockton and Karl Malone. So they beat the Jazz each year. But I know I'm really looking forward to. I think the most recent episodes focused on like the '98 Eastern Conference Finals against the Pacers. That was a series I loved watching. Which is weird because the two players I hated the most at that time in my life were Michael Jordan and Reggie Miller. And so to see them against each other brought out the best in both of them, I thought. So I'm interested in seeing that episode when it comes out, or when I get around to it, I should say.
Well, I'll tell you right now, you are going to love it when you get around to watching it. It has been fantastic. These last 2 episodes were really awesome. But, Tam, we just want to thank you again for joining the show, taking a little time out of your day with no sports right now to talk to us. We really appreciate it. But that's going to do it for episode 6 of the Bench Podcast. For Brandon Ladd, Jake Johnson, and our special guest today, Mets beat reporter Tim Britton of The Athletic, Aaron Valentino, and everybody, you can have a fantastic rest of your day.